Mr. Nader, we would be looking at what you sent us, or is it loaded in Simile now?
It's in some.
It's in Simile, because I know we got an email, so I didn't.
Yeah.
Same presentation, though. Okay, Finance Committee is in session, and we have Christine Kushner here, Vice Chair Lindsay Mahaffey, and Chris Haggerty, and Karen Carter, and we have Dr. Martin online. And I think that's it right now. I welcome all the board members, and Ms. Scott is here coming in, and Mr. Sutton is here as well. So thank you, everyone, for being here. We'll start with a motion to approve the minutes from our last finance meeting. Have a second?
Second.
All those in favor? Opposed? Thank you. The minutes have been approved. Okay. Mr. Nieder, you ready to start? Or do you start this one?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes. Thank you, Ms. Cash. And if I could ask that the PowerPoint slide deck be loaded. We'll give that a minute.
So today we are talking about, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but we are talking about our staff compensation recommendation and update from the Finance Committee, but also we've got some new information possibly coming from our state budget that's moving along a little faster now.
Yes. And next slide, please. Yeah, as Ms. Cash just shared, we've got two additional recommendations to bring forth to you this afternoon related to staff compensation. And then depending on the Finance Committee's support of those, we do have them as placeholders on your board meeting tonight for action if there is support for that. And then a series of updates on staff compensation, the state budget, which was just proposed budget, I should say, which was just released last night, and some other matters related to it. I want to start with the two recommendations, so if we could go to the next slide, please. The first recommendation is a follow-up to the employee retention and recognition bonus that we presented to you 2 weeks ago and that you approved 2 weeks ago in your board meeting. And that bonus 2 weeks ago was, again, as it's defined, a retention and recognition bonus of $1,250 to be paid this month, the month of November, to employees that are eligible. And that was funded using funds that had been reserved in the board's unassigned fund balance. It was reserved. We're coming back to you today with a recommendation to continue periodic employee recognition and retention bonuses all the way through calendar year 2022. So basically January through December. And I'll go through the mechanics of that in a minute. These are above and beyond what's being paid in the current month. There are three proposed bonuses to be paid during calendar year 2022. Each one of them is recommended to be $1,250, targeting payment in the months of January, May, and November of 2022. Just as the November 2021 bonus, all benefit earning employees would be eligible. Part-time employees, eligible employees, would receive a pro rata bonus. It's estimated that those three bonuses and the associated benefits we have to pay on top of them will cost just over $80 million. We currently have $68 million in federal ESSER funding that is not specifically assigned or committed at this point. So the recommendation would be to use that $68 million, and then the additional $12.7 million that will be required for these three bonuses. Again, we're recommending use of ESSER funding and going through and repurposing some of the ESSER funds that are already committed. We'll come back. That won't be needed until the third of the recommended bonuses, because we do have that $68 million already. But we would come back to the board with what we would repurpose as it relates to that. Upon the board's approval, these bonuses still would be contingent on the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction approving our proposal. We believe it would have their support based on what they have supported in other districts, but it does have to be contingent on their formal approval. Then the last bullet on this slide, based on how things turn out, and this is looking forward 13 months from now, 14 months from now, we will look at a potential additional $1,250 bonus to be paid January of 2023. That's looking way out. We're not bringing that forward for any action today. Just want to put it on your radar, and that would be based on conditions as well as funding availability. Before I go on to the second recommendation, and after these two recommendations, we'll have a time for questions and answers before we go on to the presentation, which is just for information. Just a very high-level update on the federal funds and where we are, because this is a significant investment, $80 million. The districts received or will receive about $380 million of federal funds. As you heard in a previous finance committee, we spent about a quarter of it already. For round numbers, I'm going to just say about $100 million has been spent. This commits an additional $80 million for these three bonuses. We must spend, based on federal requirements, at least $43 million of the federal funds, ESSER funds, on learning loss. We don't have an option. We cannot spend it on anything else. And other ESSER funding at this point is fully committed beyond this to a lot of different things that you've heard about over the past year, including things like virtual academy, additional SEL positions, M&O funding for cleaning and other purposes. So I just want to make the board aware, and we will, as we shared previously, give the board updates, periodic updates, likely in Finance Committee as we go through next calendar year on how we're doing with the ESSER funding. But we've committed with this all uncommitted ESSER funding at this point. Next slide, please.
Mr. Nieder, I'm sorry, could you say again the amount that it must be targeted towards learning loss?
I believe it's $43 million.
Thank you.
The second recommendation has to do with substitute teacher daily rates. I think everyone is fully aware of our challenges in finding enough substitute teachers to fill in for vacancies during the pandemic. It's not something unique to Wake County. It's something every district that we speak to is challenged by. But our current sub-daily rates are based on the North Carolina DPI schedule, and they're set to their minimum. So our recommendation here is, and they're more than two, but generally speaking, two different rates. One is for a non-certified sub, and one is for a certified substitute teacher. And currently the non-certified rate is $80 per day, and the recommendation is to bring that up to $104 a day. And for certified substitute teachers, the recommendation is to go from the current $103 per day and increase that to $130 per day. The estimated cost to do this for the remainder of this school year is $2.2 million. We have identified current year savings that could support it for the remainder of this school year. We would need to identify annual funding for the next fiscal year, 2022-23 and beyond, in order to maintain those rates. And we would put that into the superintendent's proposed budget as a business case as we begin development of that. And that would be presented to the board next spring. And if the board approves this, we would ask for an effective date of November 18th. Next slide, please. And with that, Dr. Mutillo and I'll be glad to answer any questions about these two recommendations.
Ms. Scott?
Thank you. And I'm sorry if you already specified this, Mr. Neters. I'm trying to take in all of this information and read and listen at the same time. But the $12.7 million that would be repurposed, did you describe where that would be coming from, what that had already sort of been earmarked for in regards to the bonuses?
Ms. Scott, what I did share, we won't need that money immediately because there is enough identified funding to fully pay the first two bonuses next year. We do need that funding to fill the gap for the third bonus. We will identify what we propose to repurpose, and we'll bring that back to the board at a future date.
Thank you.
I think Dr. Martin has a question.
Yes, thank you. In particular with the sub-pay, how many hours a day do we figure the subcontract to be?
You want to take that, Adrian?
Is it a 7-hour day, 8-hour day? Do we have a?
Yeah, we do pay a daily rate, Dr. Martin, but I think when we think of it in terms of a 7.5-hour day. But that would vary widely by the time the sub reports to the building and, stays at the end of the day. But we do look at it sort of a 7.5-hour day.
Yeah, no, I recognize that it is sort of a lump sum payment, but I wanted to put it in the context of our basic hourly wage. So 130 divided by 7.5 is 1733, and 104 is 1386. So effectively, we're talking about a 17.5 and a 1386 hourly wage for the subs. So step in the right direction, but we're still at a pretty low wage. Thank you.
Ms. Carter?
Thank you. I just had a few questions. Going back to the bonuses, because I know not all of our employees are getting them, do we know how many of our employees are not receiving the bonuses?
Well, first, the vast majority are receiving it. It would only be substitute teachers, for example, that unless they're a permanent sub, they are not benefit earning. But even people that don't necessarily work a full 8-hour day, like child nutrition staff or bus drivers, they are all fully eligible for the full bonus.
Correct. But I know some employees that are not benefit earning and that are teachers in our school that have reached out and they're not getting the bonuses. So I was just trying to see if we had an idea for a number, because I am concerned about those.
So we could have some teachers who are employed, let's say, for like 20% or 2 months of employment that don't earn leave benefits or any type of benefits at all and would not be eligible for the bonus.
Ms. Carter, though, but to your point, we can certainly pull that information and take a look at it and bring it back to the board so you have a sense of what's what.
Okay.
And that may also inform staff to make some additional potential recommendation.
Yeah, because I guess for me that is a concern because they're consistently being left out of that. So, and then the other question I had was, you mentioned we had to, even if it is brought forth tonight and the board does approve it, then we would be technically still waiting for DPI to approve. Do you have an estimated timeframe for how long that could possibly take?
Well, not to be presumptuous, but we have already begun, if not completed, the application. We have not submitted it. That would be presumptuous. We believe, and I think Brian Pittman's in the audience, please correct me if I'm wrong, I think it's they say about a 30-day window, but we feel comfortable at this time setting that targeted expectation that the first one would be January of 2022.
Okay.
And I'm happy to add, at this time, we have submitted, and they've worked very quickly. There are 2 rounds of approval. We've already gotten the first one, and so they're, I think, trying to work very quickly on our behalf. One more round of approval.
Okay, all right, thank you.
That's good.
And then the last thing, and it just slipped, I just wanted to confirm, I guess, because you stated it, and I just want to go back to it, because I know we've had some folks reach out and ask that we use the federal funds for pay increases, and that I know we've talked about it, or in an email, had exchanges. And could you clarify if we are allowed to use that, or like you've also just stated that it appears that now we have now allotted or committed all of our federal funds? Is that correct? So just, I know that's kind of two-sided, but if you don't mind just addressing both.
No, absolutely, Ms.
And that's it.
Carter.
Thank you.
And actually, in the update presentation, you'll hear some similar information. But yes, it's our understanding through reviewing the federal guidelines and also discussing with the North Carolina Department of Public Instruction. And let me, I guess, add something there. Federal guidelines are just that, federal guidelines. It's the Department of Public Instruction's role, one of their roles, to interpret those guidelines and then in turn provide guidance to the LEAs in the state of North Carolina on what those guidelines mean, or what within the guidelines they will or won't approve. And based upon DPI's guidance, and we've reached out to them multiple times, things like a retention bonus are an acceptable use of these federal funds. And DPI, while they have not ruled out using those funds to increase base pay, they haven't closed the door, but they've all but said you can apply, but it will likely not be approved. The other thing I'll point out with that, even if we were to use ESSER funds for increasing base compensation for staff, that's a recurring expenditure, unless we want to have a RIF down the road. So it's a recurring expenditure, and once the ESSER funds are exhausted, would require local funding. And to that point, of all the federal funds we've received, we've already committed about $45 million worth of those funds to recurring expenditures. The SEL positions is one example, some of the M&O funding. So we've already got kind of a down the road in a couple years, we've got to find approximately $45 million of funds, local funds, in order to keep doing those various things, or have to make some kind of adjustment. So even if it were allowed to use towards, let's say, base compensation, that would only grow that $45 million number that much higher. But again, that's a hypothetical. DPI said we could apply, but doubtful it would be approved.
Ms. Mahaffey?
Thank you. Dr. Michello, I think this question is more for you, as we're talking about substitute teachers and pay and the qualifications needed to be a sub. With a certified sub, I imagine you need a teaching degree. But in order to become a non-certified sub within the system, there are several routes. Can you kind of talk about what those are and who put those requirements in place?
Yeah, so in general, it's a high school diploma, and then also taking our sub online course, as well as, having reference checks like any other employee would, because subs are employees. So, yeah, those are the basic requirements to be a non-certified sub.
And is there a financial commitment to take that course? Because
Yeah,
I know
there-
there used to be offered by Wake Tech.
Right. And it's now online. I think it's $29 to take the course. We've actually recently looked into bringing the course in-house to see if we could, generate some savings for our applicants there. But it's something that we're currently looking at and evaluating and developing.
Okay.
But yeah, there's a cost.
And is that a DPI requirement to have that course in place?
I don't think it's a DPI requirement. We do want to make sure that the folks that we're putting in classrooms, alone with our kids on a daily basis do have some level of training. So whether it's that particular course or some other training, I do think we still want to keep that training component in place.
Okay, and the training is required before you apply to be a sub, or is it after?
You can do it concurrently, but
Okay.
before you are approved, you would need to complete it.
All right, thank you for clarifying
Sure.
that.
And it's about depending on how quickly you take it, a sort of a half-day course, so it can be taken fairly quickly.
Okay, thanks.
Okay, Mr. Haggerty and then Ms. Kushner.
Thank you, Ms. Cash. So I want to ask maybe the other side of the coin to what Ms. Carter had asked about with permanent pay raises. On the other side of the spectrum of the permanent pay raise, we know that right now with our labor situation, we're having to ask a lot of other staff, everyone involved in staff to do more. And I think everyone is doing more. And we've talked about this before, and I just want to get some clarity in terms of use of ESSER funds. Where we have staff that are taking on not just being asked to do more, but specifically defined roles, such as a COVID coordinator or a media coordinator who's taking on the role of a tech contact where a position isn't filled. Is there any way to provide, compensation, not where we're tracking more hours and tracking more duties, but where there's a specific job role that's been taken on?
Good question, Mr. Haggerty. And to some degree, yes, ESSER funds can be used for extra duty assignments. If we're truly having someone on an ongoing basis take on a new or different function, it's not just a portion of their day like extra duties as assigned, then the most appropriate thing would be to put them in a different position, which would, based on the position, have a different pay scale. Good example of that are the positions we're looking at creating related to the $18 million grant that we'll be receiving for those COVID-based positions. But the funds could be used for that. As we talked about extra duty across the district and across the myriad of roles that our various staff serve, it started to get very complex. And when you start including one group and excluding another, and that's why we went with the approach of this overall retention and recognition bonus, recognition that everybody is picking up extra things. And to try to really divide out who is and who isn't or how to measure that, it gets messy.
Thank you.
Ms. Kushner.
Thank you, Ms. Cash. And I wanted to go back and get clarity on, because I think there's been some misinformation surrounding our plans and what we've already done. So I really would like clarification on which employees. You said the vast majority are receiving the bonuses. I can understand subs are temporary and don't receive benefits, so I understand why they would not be eligible. Our school nurses, because they're county employees, I'm assuming they've been getting pay raises for the last 10 years. So are they getting the bonuses?
They are not employees of the Wake
Because they're
County
not Wake
Public
County
School
employees.
System. Whatever the county does as it relates to their budget, they would be eligible
And they've
for.
been on a different pay scale than our employees, and that's always just been a separate issue. What other category? Dr. Matillo mentioned a teacher who may be working 1 day a week, so 20% that's not receiving benefits.
we have very few part-time employees. It'd be, and the eligibility for benefits is 3/4 effort, I believe.
So anyone who's,
So anyone over at 3/4 effort or above is eligible for these bonuses.
so I just encourage us to be as clear as possible to make sure our employees understand that the vast majority are receiving these
Yes.
bonuses.
Bus
So that there's
drivers.
no miscommunication or no misunderstanding about the work that y'all have done.
Yeah, so we can definitely go back and look at specifically those who are not, but just to clarify, when we talk about benefits, we also talk about leave as a benefit. So it does extend down to our 50% employees who generally do to earn some prorated leave. So the number is going to be very small, but we can certainly take another look and get the number to you and analyze sort of what that looks like in terms of who's not getting it.
Yeah, I just have concerns that there's misinformation
Sure.
out there and that we really have a responsibility to make sure that we're being accurate and clear to our employees, because this has been such a stressful school year, and we need to make sure that they know we feel a sense of urgency and we want to retain their services to our students in the school system. And along the lines of some comments have been made, and even previous to COVID, there were patterns where instructional assistants were covering as substitute teachers in our schools. With this increase, is there any thought to giving, if they would make more as a sub for that day, and I understand they have benefits in their package, is there some thought of giving, some extra duty to a instructional assistant who is serving as a substitute in their school that day?
Yeah, so there is a separate rate for an instructional assistant who serves either a half day or a full day as a substitute, and that rate, I think it's 162 or so per day, so that's actually higher than both the non-certified and the certified rate.
Okay.
What we have heard from our IAs is the concern that I may not be serving a half day or a full day, but only a period here or an hour here, and I wouldn't be eligible for that rate. And I think that goes back to the previous conversation that we were having, where we recognize that, but it's also a challenge to determine who's doing extra, who should get extra pay, and that's why, part of our recognition and retention bonuses is acknowledging these employees, IAs included, who are going above and beyond, sometimes in smaller pieces that don't get them the higher rate.
Okay, thank you. So it seems like you're addressing that concern. Thank you very much, Dr.
ma'am.
Mattila.
Do we have some other questions on this?
Somewhat related to that, if I might, that was partly why I asked the question that I did to get the hourly rate. Is the proposal you're going to be bringing to us going to be such that our IAs ought to be paid at least at the same rate as the sub? That way, I don't think we should be in a position where the IA would make more if they were a sub. I think we need the long-term commitment of the IAs. So is that going to be addressed in some of the later proposals about IA pay?
Dr. Martin, good question. The current thinking of the current recommendation that is being brought today, bringing the non-certified rate up to $103, that aligns with about $13 an hour for an average 8-hour day. Obviously, using Dr. Martin's math, using a 7.5-hour day, it's a little bit more. But that was our rationale. We did not want to have a non-certified substitute making a higher hourly rate than the current rate for instructional assistants. Again, that's just as of what the board approved 2 weeks ago based upon the now $13 an hour minimum. You'll hear later in today's presentation both what the state has done to move beyond the $13 an hour, as well as to add what you also heard 2 weeks ago, what additional things we're doing to look at options for how we can accelerate what the state's already planning to do. And those obviously would be applicable to instructional assistants as well as all support staff.
Thank you. I was hopeful and sort of anticipating that, which is why I kind of wanted that hourly rate for the subs, because I think it is important that our permanent employees are paid at a higher rate than, subs, which we absolutely need, but are not permanent employees. Thank you.
Ms. Johnson-Hosler?
So two follow-up questions on substitutes. I want to go back to an earlier point another board member made. And I certainly agree that training is necessary, but I am curious, at what point are we going to have a conversation about the impact of our labor shortage and the need to potentially figure out how to expedite making folks subs? I mean, clearly, as a board member, as a parent, as a citizen, I think we should clearly perfectly vet folk before they come in our building, but I do think that there are places where people are already vetted because they're in our building for whatever reasons. There's a number of reasons, and so I guess I'm curious, if we haven't figured that out, has somebody figured out how do we expedite getting substitutes in our building? Because two things are happening, right? We are overworking, overburden the people in the building. Simultaneously, while we do have a cadre of people who are willing to come in the building, but we can't get them in there. No fault of our own. This is just the reality that I think the entire country is facing. And so I feel like we do have to be innovative in addressing what's happening in the building versus what our processes are. And I know we love a good process, but I also recognize those processes could be holding us and hindering what's essentially the straw's already broke the camel's back. That's the first question is, and if there's not, can we look to see if people have expedited how to get background checks faster and not wait 2 weeks for those to come in? Just continuing the process, but compressing it perhaps is the first question.
So I'm always willing to look at our processes and see where we can streamline them a little bit. And in fact, we have been looking at our applicant process as a whole, and subs are a part of that. So we're looking at how can we streamline that for all applicants. I do want to point out, though, we have thousands of approved subs. I don't have the number at my fingertips, but I know it's in the thousands who have gone through the training, so they are eligible to work. And we have, depending on the day, 600 or 700 reporting to work. So it's not so much, in my opinion, that we're not getting folks in the door. We do need to incentivize some of our subs who may not be picking up jobs to begin picking up those jobs. And I think that rate helps. I think, in fact, we have over 100 to bring to you today as a part of the HR recommendations for approval. So definitely want to always look at our processes, but we do have approved subs that we hope the rate will incentivize to either begin picking up jobs or maybe pick up more jobs than they have been, because we've had some outstanding subs through the pandemic, and I don't want to lose sight of that.
I sent us several teachers who are stay-at-home moms who went through the process to make me happy, but aren't willing to be subs. I guess my point is we have to walk and chew gum, whatever that saying is.
Sure.
Yes, you should incentivize the current pool, and yes, we should be looking at a process to expedite the people who clearly are flooding our emails and requesting that, yes, I want to be a sub, how do I do that? I guess my point is we do really good focus on one thing, and I feel like we have to figure out how we focus on multiple things at one time, because one trick is not solving our issues, I guess is my point. So certainly I know that we have a great pool of subs, many of them certified teachers who, for whatever reason, aren't ready to come back in the building, and an incentive may work, but it also may not.
Sure.
So yes, and I guess is.
Yes,
I'm
ma'am.
going to take us back to my original when I first came on the board, both and. The second question, still similarly, I think along the lines that several board members have brought up, is it, again, sorry, Dr. Matillo, more work for your office every time I talk. But I guess I'm also curious, have we taken a look at our schools who clearly have articulated not enough adults in the building to do the job? Because I do get it would be complex and overburdensome for people to figure out, did the IA do 2 class periods today, half a day tomorrow, right? I get that it would be hard to track that, but I am curious if we can take a look at the schools where it's clearly obvious that they need more people in the building to actually take a look. And so I don't know if it's a study or, time survey that you could do for 1 month, 30 days to figure this out. But I do imagine there are going to be buildings where the IA may not be working half a day and be eligible for sub pay every day, but certainly that could happen because a teacher gets sick or the sub leaves. So I guess I don't want us to miss the opportunity to get messy, because that's where we are. we're already there. So to say it's not, it would be messy is an understatement at this point. So I'm speaking as a board member who has schools who severely need adults in the building. And so everybody is being called to work extra duty and overburden. And I feel like we have to continue to bring conversation. And I feel like, of course, there's strategy somewhere that we just may not have thought about until we start asking these complicated questions. So I'm not sure if we start with a study for those schools to really take a look at, is there some consistency where I really may be spending a total of 30 days, half of those are half a day as a sub.
Yeah, I think in response, it's definitely something we can look at. We were actually meeting yesterday about some of these opportunities and looking at things like sub-fill rates by schools and vacancies by schools, and we can certainly keep drilling down to see some of those schools that are in more of a challenging shape and what we might do differently for them.
And especially those schools who don't have the sub rates, but they are having, the school social worker is teaching 4 classes a day, right? So I also don't want to ignore those schools who may not have a high sub rate, but they're actually using more people in the building double duty.
Ms. Mahaffey.
Thank you. And I think that goes to the question of the employees who, let's say, are 20%. All of our employees are stretched. Even our 100% employees are doing more than 100%. So, I mean, I'm curious what it would be to prorate that bonus to that level, knowing that everybody's doing more than the percentage that they signed up for.
Ms. Mahaffey and to Ms. Carter, who brought that up, I took some notes. We will look at how many of these individuals that we have, what roles they're serving in, and then based upon that, we'll share the numbers with you. And if staff recommends some type of adjustment, we will come back with that.
I'm
as
just
appropriate.
thinking, anyone who's been not 100% at a school knows that you're always doing a little bit more. And I can't imagine that if you're 20%, you're holding firm on that 20% during this time. If they say, I need coverage here, I need coverage there.
Do we have any other questions? Okay, let's move to the next presentation.
Okay, if we could pull the slide deck, the same slide deck back up, please.
We're on slide 6.
Yeah, I'll go ahead and start then. I just, for the audience, wanted to, although I think it's mostly staff at this point. But Sharon, if you're listening, I know you are, if you could check with Donna and see about pulling the slide deck up to slide 6 of the PowerPoint. The next section, we'd like to update you on other staff compensation-related matters. Just a recap very quickly on the recent compensation recommendations, status of the state biennium budget, which was just released at the end of the day, early evening yesterday. Want to refresh and remind the board about something as it relates to ESSER funding distribution. A brief review, and we've already discussed it, of what federal ESSER funds can and likely would not be approved for use. And then finally, next steps in funding support staff minimum hourly rate scenarios beyond the $13 that the board approved a couple weeks ago. So if we could go to the next slide, please, slide 7. The recent compensation recommendations to the board include the $13 per hour staff minimum that was approved 2 weeks ago, utilizing local funding, the $1,250 bonus, recognition and retention bonus that we paid this month was approved 2 weeks ago. the 1% increase to the certified salary staff schedule using local funding, which was approved 2 weeks ago and will be paid retroactively back to July 1 of this school year. The recommended, as of today, 3 bonuses for calendar year 2022, each one being a $1,250 recognition and retention bonus. And then also recommended today, pending board consideration of approval, the increase in the substitute daily rates, which would be funded locally with funding available for the current year, funding needing to be identified for the 22-23 year to maintain that rate. Slide 8. Sharon, if you're still out there, we're still not seeing the slide deck, and Corrali, I'm not sure if you could assist as well. Next, want to switch to the status of the state budget. I think November 15th may be a new record in the latest I've seen, or we've seen, a state proposed budget, but better late than not. I checked, and I think it came out right around 5 o'clock, somewhere 5:30 last night. It's currently under analysis by staff, but the following slides are a real initial takeaway of what we see. And it's not of the entire budget, because as you know, the budget goes well beyond staff compensation. It touches all aspects of funding for the state, and in our case, for public education. And it even goes outside of just funding. So all we're focusing on today, as far as giving you highlights, is just the compensation-related pieces for public education, not anything else. Obviously, we'll come back to a future board meeting, work session, or maybe finance committee meeting with a more global update. But with the focus right now being on compensation, and that hot off the press last night, we wanted to give you some information. Obviously, at this point, it's just a legislative proposed budget by the Joint Conference Committee. It will be headed, I think, by the end of the week to the governor's desk, and then the governor will need to make a decision on whether he supports that or not, and we'll see what happens. So next slide, please. Slide 9. The teacher compensation based on the proposal, each step would be adjusted by 1.3%. This is the first time I recall a step being changed in years. And that's distinct from teachers getting a step increase. But if you look at the schedule, the current schedule would have each step increased by 1.3% above and that would be for each of the 2 years in the biennium. In addition, then, in the state proposal, teachers would receive a step increase in each of the 2 years, so for both the current year and next year. And most of those step increases would be at a higher rate, although you'll recall there are some periods still in the overall budget, and I don't know if they've done anything in what was released last night to further address it. It's possible they have, but we haven't drilled down that far. There are periods, I think it's around 15 years, step 15, and then in the 20s, where they flatten out for a number of years before they go back up.
And can I ask a quick question? Is this the rate for Wake County? Because they had pulled out 5 counties that would not receive as much as 95 other counties, and Wake County was one of the 5 counties that was not going to receive.
I got this one.
Thank you.
So I'm actually just reading an email about that. That's a separate allocation in the budget that provides it provides millions of dollars. It's $100 million specifically for counties to provide teachers a supplement in their salary.
Okay.
because, you know, not all counties provide a supplement, and the supplement is dependent on its local funding that is added to the state teacher salary schedule. And so this $100 million is going to most counties in North Carolina, but there are 5 counties that are excluded from accessing any of that $100 million. And the way they've calculated is that it excludes counties by the $40 billion tax base cutoff. And so the counties that are excluded are Wake, Mecklenburg, Durham, Guilford, and Buncombe.
Thank you, Superintendent Moore. So this is for everyone, and then
But not for the
this is
districts I
for-
just mentioned.
This will be extra on, and I think we need to say for the public that the state per pupil payments to Wake County, we're like 110th of 116 LEAs. So we're already low.
You'll see another example in a couple of slides with regards to the distribution of the ESSER funding.
Thank you.
And then if we could pull the slide deck back up to slide 9, please. The average increase for teachers based on the legislation is 2.5% for each of the 2 years.
And I just need to say, an average 2.5% means you have a good chunk below that and then some above that. And that has to do with those vagaries in the way the schedule is created and when there are plateaus within them. So it really is a disparate impact in terms of teachers at which years of experience are getting how much of a raise. And that is just very problematic in terms of how the schedule was created.
And again, at a future meeting, after we've had the time to truly assess what Superintendent Moore just described, we'll bring a detailed update on what that really means for teachers at all levels. And if we're on slide 10, please. The principal schedule receives a 2.5% increase to the state base pay in each of the 2 years in the biennium. And for assistant principals, and you'll recall assistant principals are paid based upon the teacher schedule A plus 19%. Because the teacher schedule A is moving, when you do that plus 19%, they're seeing that average 2.5% increase as well. Next slide, please, slide 11.
Does this include a hold harmless for principals,
There,
as we talk about principal pay?
I will need to look to see if there's a hold harmless. There has consistently been. In the past, we did not get that far in looking. We looked at the summer. We didn't drill down into the
I
actual
realize this just came out
legislation.
yesterday, so, yeah.
But we will look at that. Even beyond that, we have had historically a held harmless internally as it relates to, because we supplement the state schedule with local funding to pay our principals. And so we've had an internal hold harmless policy, if you will, above and beyond anything the state has done. We're now on slide 11, talking about non-certified support staff. Included in the legislation is bringing non-certified support staff to a minimum of $13 per hour for 2021-22, bringing those same staff to a minimum $15 per hour for the second year in the biennium, 22-23. And for those non-certified support staff that are already at those minimums at those times, they would see a 2.5% increase in each of the 2 years, or a total of 5%, a little over 5% because it's compounded. I think Ms. Mahaffey has a question.
Sorry. Mr. Nieder, when the state raised all state salaried employees, unless you work for a school district, $15 an hour, I recall you saying that that did not include compression. Are we seeing compression included in this raise to a minimum?
Good
Or are we-
question, and again, we haven't drilled down at this
Okay.
point. I I'm not going to hazard a guess at the table, but if history repeats itself, the compression issue will not have been addressed. But again, to be determined.
Okay.
And just as the board has heard, when we've offered proposals, while it's not an immediate issue, it's kicking the can down the road a bit, and the next year and the year after and the year after, it becomes an issue, if not addressed. Last couple things I want to point out on this slide for the board. Going back to the board's approved budget, as you know, a budget has to make assumptions based on uncertainties down the road. So the superintendent's proposed budget, and then working all the way to what is now the board's approved budget, not reconciled, approved but not reconciled, had assumptions on what the state would legislate regarding compensation matters, and then based on those assumptions, determine what was the amount of local funding that would be required to fund the local component of the state requirements. Now that we have something specific, we need to cost this out and determine, is the local funding set aside in the board's proposed budget, or board's approved budget, excuse me, enough to cover what's now been legislated? Or it may be more. And if it's more, we can shift those local funds to another use. But if it's less, and there's a bigger local requirement based on this final legislation, we will need to identify where that funding will come from. That will become part of our budget reconciliation process. We'll bring those recommendations to the board, work through them, and then ultimately that will lead to a final budget resolution for the current year for the Board of Education. Next slide, please, slide 12. Also included in the state's proposal, school psychologists, speech pathologists, and audiologists would receive a $3,500 annual supplement. School counselors would receive a $1,000 annual supplement. Next slide, please.
Can you clarify, is that supplement like a bonus, or is that to the base?
Dr. Martin, we will have to check. It was not labeled as a bonus, so I'm optimistic it would be added to the base and eligible for retirement, but we certainly need to clarify that.
Thank you.
So now on slide 13, and this, what I'm going to go over, was included, I believe, in the House's proposal, but a $1,000 one-time premium pay bonus for all employees. And again, we'll need to look at the state's definition of what all employees means, just as the board has been discussing on these locally funded bonuses, looking at what we might do as it relates to, let's say, a 20% effort staff. But the state will determine what the rules are here. And then for those eligible employees earning under $75,000 per year, an additional $500, so a total of $1,500. And as one thinks about our school district and the makeup of the employees, the vast majority do not make $75,000. So again, and we'll get the numbers, but the vast majority of Wake County employees would be eligible for the $1,500 bonus. Want to point out that these bonuses are independent of the bonuses we recommended to you 2 weeks ago to be paid in November, and you approved, and the bonuses in our first recommendation this afternoon. This is in addition to those. The one thing we have to confirm is whether or not the state will provide funding for this bonus for non-state funded employees. I'm not going to hazard a guess. I think it will be covered by the state, but if not, the good news is it's an additional $1,500 bonus for all employees, including those that are funded through local funds. But if the state won't help us cover it, that means we're going to have to identify local funding or another funding source for that. So again, that's one of the challenges of bringing you something that's not even been on the press for 24 hours. To be determined. The good news is it's there.
I'm sorry, the husband was here a minute ago, and he left. And
He's aged horribly since he's been here.
You've gained hair, honey.
Thank you. Let's roll on. I appreciate, Mr. Nieder, one of the things you were that you distinguished, that these bonuses in the state budget are independent from the locally funded budget. But I'm curious with the state budget terms about increasing the hourly wages. When we've recommended an increase in the hourly wages too, will one supplant the other? Will one supplement the other? How will that work?
Great question. Effectively, by the state, assuming this is signed by the governor, by the state legislating minimum $13 an hour, state-funded employees, the state will provide funding to bring them to 13. What the board approved 2 weeks ago was using local funding to support that. So assuming this does come to fruition, that would free up that local funding amount to be determined that could be used to further apply against, for example, the non-certified schedule to potentially further accelerate it. And then, again, let's fast forward a year and let's assume that this budget comes to fruition and the $15 minimum in the second year of the biennium isn't changed by the legislature. And effectively, that too could then free up at that point if we had invested some additional local funds to get beyond 13 or even beyond 14 to get us back.
And ultimately, the board would approve those changes through the budget reconciliation process.
Which is at the same time we would be bringing the salary schedule recommendation.
Thank you. Because I see the governor has come out and he has said that he would sign the budget. And of course, knock on wood, you never want to say anything is done until it's done. But it also looks like then moving from 13 to 15 as well is in the plan. And so then I didn't know if any of what we've looked at and we've been willing to, offer, maybe that could be used to address compression.
Yeah, and a couple slides on, I will come back to that, and I think towards the end we're going to talk about what we're looking at to go beyond 13, and we'll come back to that.
And will the state increases be retroactive to July 1 like we had
They generally
discussed?
are.
They generally are?
Again, haven't looked at the legislation. I can only recall one year, was either last year or the year before, where recommendations were to be effective as of, let's say, mid-year, January. But generally speaking, they have done things retroactively. We'll clarify that
Yes.
when we get into the detailed
Thank you. That would be helpful to
legislation.
clarify and to recognize that if we had had a budget sooner than now, we could have had so much more reassurance for our employees during this very difficult school year. I mean, I think that should not be unsaid.
It's Dr. Martin.
Thank you. I was just going to mention, as Chris did, that if all this comes through, I think we should use the monies that we've set aside primarily to address compression, because getting the minimum wage up is great, but I think compression is one of our real big challenges, and I think we should use some of our local dollars to do that. But thanks.
Okay. Slide 14, please. Okay, we're jumping out of what's included in the state budget on compensation and really getting into the next update. And I just want, it's one slide, just want to remind the board that for the majority of the federal funding that flowed through DPI to the LEAs, the vast majority of it was not allotted on a per ADM basis. It took other factors into account. And the reason I bring this up, I think there's been a lot of attention paid by all of us, and appropriately, about what other districts are or are not doing with their federal funds and how they're applying them. And so I think it's important to understand other districts may have, based on their relative size and based upon how they were funded, the rate they were funded, better opportunities than Wake does to do things. So let me just walk you through the numbers. Two districts that we've been compared to recently are both Durham and Randolph. And I'm going to walk you through the chart. If you go to the very top, you'll see the Durham, Randolph, and Wake County pages. The top line, those are the ADM projections for the current year, number of students projected based on DPI's projections. Then all of the next lines are the various forms of federal funding, and then a total at the bottom. So Durham received about $176 million of federal funding. Randolph received about $53 million, and Wake $386 million. But then when you make that relative, because we're all different sizes, and you look at it truly on an ADM basis, which is not how it was allotted, but how much did they effectively receive per student? Durham received $5,400.16 per student. Randolph received $3,451, and Wake County received $2,398. So trying to kind of, well, what would it look like if it was apples and apples, which it's not? If Wake County were funded at the Durham per ADM number, instead of receiving the $386 million, we would have received about $873 million. And if Wake were funded at the Randolph rate, instead of receiving the 386, we would have received $556 million. So again, it is what it is. There's nothing we can do about it. I'm not here to say that the state's allotment formula for this wasn't good. I guess my only comment there might be that in many cases, and we can use staff compensation as an example, the board's spoken this afternoon at length about this previously. We may do it when we talk about the action items being presented tonight. The efforts that all of our staff are going through and to in support of our core business as we go through this pandemic. And I don't know that that's really different from school district A to school district B to school district C, even though they may have higher needs. But effectively, those school districts are receiving other supplemental funding to address that. So I just throw that out there. Again, this is information only, and just my takeaway would be when we compare what other districts are doing, just keep in mind it's not apples and apples.
And these allotments are figured by the state, not the federal.
Pardon me?
These allotments are figured out by the state and not the federal government.
That is my understanding, correct. And this information is all on DPI's website. If you wanted to go look at every LEA in the district, it's even out there for charter schools.
Yeah, Ms. Carter?
And I just want to point out, though, that some of these districts, I know Durham, for instance, took action before they received all this funding. So I just want to state that as well.
Right. Next slide, please. Slide 15. So just, again, a brief recap on what ESSER federal funds can be used for related to compensation. We've already kind of heard this earlier, but they can be used upon approval for employee retention bonuses. The use of ESSER funding would likely not be approved to provide employee-based compensation increases. And again, keeping in mind that ESSER, whatever we do with ESSER, it's a non-recurring stream, and any recurring expenditures assigned to ESSER must find a replacement, local funding likely, over the span of the next 2 to 3 years. Currently, we've got $45 million of those commitments that we're going to have to find funding for. Next slide, please.
Mr. Nita, why is there this confusion, or some of our large groups saying that this ESSER fund can be used for base compensation? Has the DPI talked to other people and given different information?
Well, Ms. Cash, let me distinguish between base compensation and increases to base compensation. We are using ESSER funds at this time for base compensation. We moved, I think it was $8-ish million worth of new SEL positions. Those are being funded with ESSER funds. So effectively, we are using ESSER funds to fund base compensation for those positions. But let me then distinguish that from taking an existing, let's say, state-funded individual and saying, I want you to make more than this, and I'm going to use ESSER funds to make up that difference. That's what we're told would likely not be approved. And also, even if it were eligible, it's got a big price tag down the road because it's a non-recurring.
Now, I assume it's not eligible for it, but I was just seeing if there are other conversations happening that are giving out different information from DPI on that. We get a lot of information from the teachers' organization saying that they were told they could use that. So I just wanted to get to the chase.
I would just share, Ms. Cash, that anytime there's a complex set of rules and regulations around something, and in this case, this federal funding, and what can and can't be done, it's number one, both complicated. It's number two, by perhaps people that aren't familiar with, and they don't do that sort of thing, deal with these sorts of rules and regulations on a daily basis, and they're more of a lay person looking at it. It may be harder for them to, tease things out, or that may not be their forte. It's incumbent upon us to provide that teasing out. And last, I would just throw out there, in my personal observation, I think some misinformation has been thrown out there quite intentionally. Okay, slide 16, and we're wrapping up. I believe this is the last slide. Next steps in funding support staff minimum hourly rates beyond the $13 an hour that the board did approve 2 weeks ago. We just literally, starting last night, began a high level, I won't even say analysis, we just pulled out what was in the legislation. We didn't really analyze it. That's the next step. And many of the questions that you asked during this afternoon's meeting about, does it mean this or that? And I said, we have to go back now and go into not the summaries, but the true legislation and read through it to understand that, and in some cases interpret it. We will begin, in fact, I had a conversation with my team earlier today that we've got to set up time tomorrow to come up with a game plan for how we're going to break that apart. But as we do that, and as I shared earlier, we are going to cost out what the cost of local cost is of implementing the state legislation. We'll do this now. We're not going to wait to see what the governor does. We're moving forward with estimating that now. And that would indicate that the funding in the board's approved budget, local funding, is aligned with what it takes to support this. We may have some extra local funding that we could use to say, use it towards, for example, the support staff schedules to accelerate beyond the 13, or we may not have enough local funding, and we may need to find other sources. So those are all question marks. We go through the analysis, we'll be able to answer those questions, and then based on that, offer recommendations based upon availability. I do want to mention that I believe there's been, well, let me back up. You all have seen in prior presentations that in order to bring all staff to $15 and then maybe to $17, and I think our example was $17.33, and address compression, had some really big price tags associated with it. It's my understanding, I'm going to let the superintendent perhaps fill in, that there's been some initial conversation between the board chair, Mr. Sutton, and his counterpart on the commission, and then between the superintendent and her counterpart, County Manager Ellis, about looking at, is there any opportunity for some additional local funding mid-year that might be used to, again, accelerate this. I don't know that we're in a position to share any more than just what I did, but Superintendent Moore.
I would just say that the conversations have been ongoing for several years, quite frankly, about how to get there. But the more recent conversations really have been about sharing the numbers. What would it take to get to different points? And based on what the legislature does, what would it take to move forward and address compression and those kinds of things? I think there is an interest in understanding what those numbers are, to understand what the options are and how soon they can be implemented and how they would impact the superintendent and eventual board budget requests to the county commissioners moving forward. So and the intent, I think, is to try to build those scenarios out and bring forth what options we can at the first December board meeting, so that maybe there'll be an opportunity for a decision point then. And so those conversations have begun with myself and the county manager. I do believe that Chair Sutton has had some conversation with Chair Calabria, and would let him say anything about what those conversations have yielded.
I was just piggybacking and say I think that there is some interest in continuing our relationship and partnership with county in that regard. Anything going forward, that has been our practice in the last couple of years, to look at a multi-year funding approach to do so. And so to the extent that we can look at some of these numbers and figure out how to do that over a multi-year piece would be helpful.
And, I'll point out the good news now that there finally is a state legislative proposal on the table, 2-year proposal. We now have something, while it's not been approved, and even if it's approved by the governor, signed by the governor, in the second year, in the short session, it could be changed. But we at least have some level of certainty that we can then now make recommendations off of, as opposed to total uncertainty that we can recommend things, because we are required by state law. Any recommendations we bring, there's got to be funding underneath it. So, as Superintendent Moore said, we do plan to come back to your next meeting after we've done further analysis, and we can have better information on specifically what will the proposed state budget require in terms of local funding vis-a-vis what was included in the board's approved budget. Is it, we going to need more money, or are we going to free up savings? Are we sort of right on there? That will be a big indicator. Because beyond that, in order to accelerate anything as it relates to support staff compensation, the funding would have to be repurposed from somewhere, unless there are savings identified, which means it's a zero-sum game. Here's the amount of funding we have. It's all allocated, so to speak. And if we want to put some more over here, well, that's fine. Where we're going to take it from. Dr. Matillo, would you like to add anything? Any words of wisdom?
Ms. Kushner
Yeah,
had
I
a
would
question
want-
too.
But for tonight, we are taking action on the 3 bonuses for 2022.
Yes,
And the
ma'am.
substitute pay. Those are on our action agenda
Yes,
tonight.
they're on the action agenda, so we'll be bringing those back tonight for your consideration of approval.
And we're going to clearly communicate that to our staff so that we have clarity in what they know and communication. Thank you. And your wisdom, Dr. Matillo, I don't know.
So, I'm Dr. Matillo, I'm going to let you.
It's gone now.
Just to recap then.
Wait, Dr. Matillo
He
is.
couldn't remember.
He can't, he's forgotten?
He did.
I think he's kidding, but go ahead.
Is he? Go ahead.
I am not going to speak over the superintendent or the chair of the finance committee.
Okay.
So y'all go ahead.
I was just going to recap 2 action items this evening, one related to the increases in subpay, one related to the additional bonuses through the 22 school year and into the 22-23 school year. And then given the additional and conversations that have already begun with our county partners and the action from the legislature bringing the board a proposal at the first December board meeting regarding increasing the compensation, being able to accelerate perhaps some of the work that we've already done through the dollars that have been received and what we have available.
That was my question, Dr. Matillo. Now? The floor is yours.
No, I really just want to say, thank you to all of you on the board and the superintendent and the chair who are advocating, with our partners. When I look at the state budget and $15 an hour, in the second year, I don't think we can wait. I think what we need to try to find a way to do is increase that minimum and address compression. And I think as a staff, we are committed to doing that over the next couple of weeks now that we have some more information, and we'll do everything we can to get there for our employees.
Dr. Matillo has been very, very big proponent of making a great stride in our salary schedule. So I thank you for that. So I hope our employees understand a lot of work has gone into that from human resources and finance. Ms. Scott?
Thank you. I appreciate all of the work that you've done, especially getting this information just yesterday, and of course, trying to go through all of the state budget as it pertains to our employees and compensating our employees. And so, of course, I've had limited time as well to try to digest all of it. But could you, if you can, touch a little bit on how the state is paying for these increases, these proposed increases?
Well, let me give you a layperson's version, and again, without going into the actual legislation. Can't get very specific, but just like the county has various revenue streams, and the county at the local government level, it's true for all counties across the state, 2 primary sources of revenue are property taxes and sales taxes. At the state, the primary revenues are income taxes, personal and corporate income taxes. The state has a slew of other funding streams, including funding from the federal government, various forms, but the majority, it comes in the form of taxes. And so when they look at a budget, they look at their projected revenue for the year. And they've got to, like every other state, unlike the federal government that can kind of print money, so to speak, or have an unbalanced budget, states cannot, or at least this state cannot. And so they look at projected revenues. They don't do what's called a zero-based budget. They look at where they are today. A zero-based budget is kind of saying, let's wipe the slate clean, let's ignore what's happened in the past, and let's say these are our revenues for next year, where are we going to put them? The state, just as Wake County public school system, does an iterative budget. Where were we last year? Where do we want to make increases or new initiatives? Where do we want to cut back? And so they're basing their decisions based on their revenue projections. Another thing they look at are things like, do they want to increase reserves? And call it a rainy day fund or call it what you want. One of the things the state has been able to do, just as they were forced to cut back on those reserves during the Great Recession, and that's why they're there. They were used appropriately. But when you have the opportunity to rebuild those reserves, take advantage of those opportunities as well. So I'm not directly answering your question, but, and if you're looking specifically, are they lottery funds or are they, which revenue stream are they coming from? We can look at that. But a lot of their general revenues, and you've heard me use this example before, it's like a couple that has a joint checking account. And they both put their paychecks in it, and they go to pay the Duke Energy bill. Well, whose dollars paid it? Was it the husband or the wife? It doesn't really matter. It's just part of the state budget.
I appreciate that. I think it's very confusing on even in the best of times, in non-COVID times, when additional federal funding, new funding, one-time funding is coming in. I think it's very hard for an average person to understand exactly how our schools are funded. And I think that's where, sadly, some people are able to leverage misinformation for whatever reason, or just general confusion. I think that's very important. And I know some of my colleagues have asked, can we please make sure this is stated clearly? Because it's confusing in the best of times to understand how our schools are funded. And particularly when it relates to compensation, I don't think folks understand who sets the base pay, how our local supplements come in. I don't know that everybody really truly understands that. And I'm sure even some of us, I would fully admit that there are some things that I still learn new every day. But I was also curious, I'd been hearing that a lot of this is being funded by reserves that the state accumulated over the last 2 years of not, that there's a portion from not passing a budget. So like the raises
So that is correct. It is correct that they have accumulated funds by not having a budget for the last 2 years. And they have also, and I think it's kind of like the accumulation could potentially, the commitments that they're making, you could assume that the accumulation of funds and the commitments they're making indicate that there's greater capacity in their revenues to add these recurring expenses to their budget, because they are recurring expenses. So. And
they're recurring expenses, and there will be a point where the economy slows down, goes into hopefully a mild recession, not a great recession. And it's during those times where the revenues come down, but those recurring expenditures remain. So that's the balancing act.
Okay.
So that concludes our presentation. Again, we just have the 2 items to bring back as action items to your board meeting. And other than that, be glad to answer any final questions.
Any more questions from board? You're going to clarify? You want a question? Okay.
All right, yeah, and I just wanted to circle back for what's being brought back on December 7th. I know you mentioned possibly looking at accelerating, which I think is at this point not really something debatable. We just need to do it with salary compression and increasing non-certified staff pay. But I just wanted, because going back to employee communication that was sent, would this also include looking at those who are at the 15 or higher rates, like the bus drivers and others, adjusting any of that, or also looking at possible rates for specific staff.
I think any of those are being, well, any or all of those are being discussed and looked at and estimated, and some combination thereof will be shared. Don't know what the final recommendation, if any, will be. And I'm going to bounce Dr. Matillo's, which I share, his initiative and drive that we've got to do something to move beyond the 13. But I'm going to just temper that a little bit with the reality. In order to do it, we've got to find the funding, and it's significant.
I don't see any other questions from board members, and I think that ends our finance committee. It's going to give us a little time to kind of change some of the dynamics in front of us and put the podium back up. So thank you, everyone, for being here. And Ms. Johnson-Hausler is here. I don't think, did I mention that when you came in? Nope, she's here. Okay, thank you, everyone. We're adjourned.
Yeah. We're starting. So are we going to start like at 3:30 or are you going to wait a minute?
Yeah, maybe 5 minutes, but, so we can stay on schedule.